You cannot tell the difference between a guest and a beggar at the gate.
In the world of 1813, a woman's kindness was the cheapest thing. She owned cheaper than her dress, cheaper than her name, cheaper, certainly, than her silence. It cost nothing, and it purchased nothing. And the women who understood this earliest tended to survive the longest, though they did not always survive happily. Frances Ashby had not yet learned to be that kind of woman. At 23, with no dowry and no prospects, and a bedroom in the house her father had built that was technically no longer hers, she had learned instead to be useful, which was a different and considerably more dangerous skill, because useful women are noticed, and noticed women are compared, and comparison in a drawing room full of better-dressed competitors is rarely a kindness to anyone. On an afternoon in late September, at a tea that Cecily Ashby had arranged with the particular care of a woman who intends to make an impression, Frances helped a stranger through the garden gate and poured her a cup of tea, and Cecily made a joke of it. The joke got a small laugh. It was meant to establish something about the hierarchy of that room, and it did. But when the drawing-room door opened 20 minutes later, and a man walked in who made every person in that room recalibrate their posture, he stopped in front of the old woman with the teacup, and he bowed. Not a nod, not a vord, a bow. Cecily Ashby looked at her daughter, looked at the Duke, looked at the woman in the plain dress holding the cup that Frances had poured. There are mistakes you make once and spend years unmaking. She had just made hers. Ashbystead smelled of beeswax, cold ash, and the particular staleness of a house that had been cleaned for guests rather than lived in surfaces polished, fires lit in rooms that were not ordinarily heated. The good china brought out from the cabinet in the dining room where it spent most of its time not being used. Frances had spent the morning helping Peg carry things from one room to another according to Cecily's instructions. And by early afternoon, she had developed the particular invisibility that comes from being the person who does the carrying present enough to be useful, absent enough not to require acknowledgement. Cecily had 7 guests coming. The most important of them was Nathaniel Crale, Duke of Cresthollow, whom Cecily had been angling to introduce to her daughter Dorothea for the better part of 2 seasons, and whom she had finally, through a combination of social persistence and a shared acquaintance in Bath, managed to secure for a Tuesday afternoon in September. Dorothea had changed her dress twice that morning. Frances had noted this without comment. The garden gate was at the far end of the south lawn. Reached by a gravel path that Frances had walked so many times, she knew exactly which stones turned underfoot. She had gone out to cut the last of the autumn roses for the drawing room. Cecily had wanted them on the mantelpiece by 3, when she heard the sound from the other side of the gate. Not a cry, but a sharp intake of breath, and then a silence that was somehow louder. She set her basket down and opened the gate, and found a woman of perhaps 68 sitting on the grass with her back against the gatepost and one hand pressed to her knee, which she had clearly caught on the stone when the latch gave way unexpectedly. The woman was dressed plainly good fabric, but not new, and no jewelry that Frances could see, and she had the expression of someone who was more annoyed than hurt, which Frances found immediately reassuring. "The latch has been loose since June," Frances said, crouching down. "I have told them 3 times. Are you hurt?" "My dignity is thoroughly inconvenienced," the woman said. "My knee is merely wet." Frances checked the knee with the brisk practicality she had developed over years of being the only person in the household who dealt with minor injuries. Confirmed there was no serious damage, and helped the woman upright. "Come in," she said. "I'll find you somewhere to sit before the others arrive." "Others," said the woman. "My aunt is entertaining this afternoon," Francis said. "You will be given tea and ignored, which I find is often the most comfortable position at this sort of event." The woman looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone deciding something. "Lead on," she said. Francis settled her in the drawing room in the chair by the window, the best chair, which was supposed to be reserved for Lady Harcourt, who was Cecily's most prestigious guest, and who Francis estimated would not actually notice which chair she sat in as long as it was not near the draught. She poured a cup from the pot that had just been brought in, checked the temperature with her wrist the way her father had taught her, and carried it to the woman with both hands. "I am Francis Ashby," she said. The woman took the cup. "Agnes," she said, and nothing further, which struck Francis as pleasingly economical. The guests arrived between 3 and past. In the order Cecily had mentally ranked them, which meant Lady Harcourt first, and everyone else arranged behind her like a small procession of decreasing importance. Cecily entered the drawing room at 3:20, surveyed the arrangements, registered Francis in the corner with the unfamiliar woman, and crossed the room with the smile she used for situations that required management. "Francis," she said, in the tone that was not quite pleasant and not quite not. "Who is your friend?" Francis opened her mouth. Before she could speak, Cecily had already turned to address the room at large. She had a gift for making small things into performances and said, with a light laugh, "You will forgive my niece. She has a habit of collecting strays from the garden. I keep telling her she cannot tell the difference between a guest and a beggar at the gate, but she is very tender-hearted." 2 of the ladies laughed. Dorothea looked at the floor. Agnes looked at no one in particular and drank her tea. Frances did not respond. She stood up, walked to the tea table, refilled the pot from the kettle on the stand, carried it back to Agnes, and poured a second cup with both hands, as though the preceding 30 seconds had not occurred. Then she sat down next to Agnes in the smaller chair and set the pot on the table between them. This was the entirety of her response, which was the only one available to her that did not require either capitulation or a confrontation she could not win. And Agnes, she noticed, watched her do it with the same expression she had used at the gate, the expression of someone deciding something. The drawing-room door opened at 4:20. Cecily heard it and turned with the particular alertness of a hostess who has been waiting for the most important guest, and her expression arranged itself into its most gracious configuration, and she rose. Nathaniel Crale, Duke of Cresthollow, was tall, dressed with the understatement of a man who has never needed to use clothing to establish his position, and he had the kind of stillness about him that came not from ease, but from long practice at giving nothing away. He crossed the threshold, registered the room, and then he stopped. He was looking at the woman in the chair by the window. Francis watched him cross the drawing room without stopping to greet Cecily, without stopping for Lady Harcourt, without pausing at all until he was standing in front of Agnes, and he bowed a full, proper bow, the kind that cost something from a man of his rank, and said, "Mother, I was not told you were here." The room did not make a sound. Agnes looked up at him with the expression of a woman who is very rarely surprised, and was not surprised now. "I was not certain I would be," she said. "A young woman let me in at the gate." She did not indicate Francis. She did not need to. Nathaniel straightened and turned, slowly, and looked at Francis, who was still sitting in the smaller chair with her hands in her lap, and the completely neutral expression she had perfected over 3 years of being looked at in ways that required no reaction. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than courtesy required. Then he looked at Cecily, who was still standing in the center of the room with her gracious expression locked in place over something that was no longer gracious at all. Cecily said nothing. There was, Francis thought, nothing useful left to say. The proposal arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the tea, delivered by Nathaniel Crale's solicitor in a letter addressed to Cecily Ashby as the head of the household, which was the first thing about it that told Francis something that he had understood. From the drawing room, exactly who held the practical authority in this house, and had worked within that understanding rather than around it. The letter was formal and unornamented, and contained no sentiment whatsoever, which was the second thing that told her something. It proposed a marriage between His Grace the Duke of Cresthollow and Miss Frances Ashby of Ashby Stead, Derbyshire, subject to the agreement of the family, with arrangements to be confirmed at the earliest convenience of all parties. That was all it said. No reason given, no explanation offered. Cecily read it at the breakfast table with Dorothea watching from across the marmalade and Francis watching from across the teapot. And when Cecily set the letter down, her face had the quality of a woman who has been handed a mathematical problem she cannot solve and is not yet ready to admit it. She sent her acceptance the same afternoon. Frances was informed of this when Peg brought her the news at 2:30. In the tone Peg used for things she had strong opinions about and had decided, after consideration, not to express at length. She said yes. Peg said, I gathered. Frances said. Peg set the water jug down on the washstand with slightly more force than was strictly necessary. You're not going to say anything about it. What would you like me to say? Frances said. Peg looked at her with the expression of a woman who could say a great deal and was exercising considerable professional restraint. Nothing, I suppose, she said, and went to lay out Frances's dress for the evening, with the resigned efficiency of someone who has learned that the women she works for make decisions that cannot be argued with, and has found a way to live with that. Frances sat at the window and looked at the garden where the gate latch was still loose, and thought about a man who had crossed a room to bow to his mother without being asked, and thought this was not the worst information available about a person. The wedding took place 10 days later at the parish church in Oldbourne, which was small and cold, and smelled of stone and tallow, and the faint sweetness of old flowers left too long in their vases. Cecily attended because not attending was unthinkable, and attending gave her the better position of appearing gracious. Dorothea attended and looked at a point slightly above Frances's left shoulder for the duration of the ceremony, which was, Frances thought, a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Agnes Crale was there, in the front pew, in the same plain dress she had worn in the drawing-room, and she watched the ceremony with the expression of someone who has arranged something and is satisfied with the arrangement without being surprised by it. Nathaniel said his vows in the same clear, unhesitating tone he appeared to use for everything. Frances said hers the same way. They walked out of the church into October air that smelled of wet leaves and distant smoke, and he handed her into the carriage with the formal courtesy of a man who has memorized the gestures of consideration without necessarily having arrived at their source. Cresthollow Grange declared itself from a mile away, rising from the Derbyshire landscape with the confident plainness of a house that had never needed to be anything other than what it was: large, well-maintained, symmetrical in a way that suggested someone had cared very much about order for a very long time. No loose gate latches here. The gravel drive was raked. The windows were clean. The staff lined up in the entrance hall with the coordinated precision of a household that ran on routine and knew it. And the housekeeper, a composed woman named Marsh, who had the posture of someone who had worked for exacting people and had become exacting herself, showed Frances to her rooms with a thoroughness that suggested she had been told to be thorough and had taken the instructions seriously. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway of her sitting room that evening after Marsh had finished and left, and he stood there for a moment in the way of someone who has something to say and has organized it. He kept his own schedule, he said, and expected her to keep hers. He did not require her presence at every meal. Only at the social engagements he would inform her of in advance. The household budget was hers to manage within the existing parameters, which Marsh could explain. He did not expect her to involve herself in the estate's business affairs or correspondence. He paused after this last item in a way that suggested there was more behind it than organizational preference. And Frances noted the pause and filed it. She said, "Understood," in the same tone she had used to say her vows, clear and without elaboration. And he looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to identify as his default, not cold exactly, but closed, the way a very good cabinet is closed, with nothing visible of what is inside. He nodded and left. She did not see him at breakfast the following morning, or the morning after that. She saw him at dinner on the third evening, where they sat at opposite ends of a table that was not so long as to make conversation impossible, but long enough to make it optional. And they exercised the option of silence in a way that was not uncomfortable, so much as provisional two people waiting to understand the terms before committing to anything. She learned the house by walking it, which was her habit in any new place. The morning room faced east and was warm until noon. The library had a window seat that looked over the kitchen garden. The study door was always closed when Nathaniel was in it, and always open when he was not. She learned the staff by watching how they moved around each other, which told her more than speaking to them directly would have. Not yet. On the fifth day, Agnes Crale arrived without prior notice in a carriage that the groom received with no sign of surprise, which told Frances this was a regular occurrence. Agnes was shown to the morning room and tea was brought, and Frances went in to sit with her because there was no reason not to. They talked, or Agnes talked and Frances listened, which was a distinction Agnes appeared comfortable with, and it was during this conversation that Agnes got up and walked to the mantelpiece to look at the small framed portrait Frances had set there the day before, the only thing she had brought from Ashby Stead that was entirely her own, a miniature of her father painted when he was perhaps 40, in the plain coat he had always preferred. Agnes stood before it for a long time. The silence had a quality Frances could not quite read. "I knew him," Agnes said at last, without turning around. "A long time ago." Frances waited for more. Agnes set the portrait down gently, with both hands, and turned and said, "You look more like your mother, I think, but you have his way of standing." And then she asked whether the morning room windows had always faced east, or whether someone had moved them, which was clearly not a serious question, and Frances understood that the topic of her father had been closed for reasons Agnes had not chosen to share yet. She thought about that conversation in the library that evening, sitting with the estate correspondence files that Marsh had located for her, not because she had been invited to read them, but because she had not been told not to, and the habit of reading whatever was available had served her well enough for 23 years that she saw no reason to discontinue it. Nathaniel was in the study, visible through the half-open connecting door as a pair of shoulders bent over a desk lamp, and he was reading something in French, she could tell by the angle at which he held the page. Slightly further from the lamp, the way English readers held French text when they were working to follow it rather than reading easily. She said nothing. She went back to the estate files. The thought arrived quietly. Without announcement, he was doing the thing she did fastest. She did not say this, either. The letter from the French shipping company arrived on a Monday in a fat envelope with 3 different wax seals and was delivered to Nathaniel's study. where it remained for 2 days before Frances saw it on the library table on a Wednesday morning, placed there by Marsh, alongside a note in Nathaniel's hand that said, simply, Caldwell advice. Caldwell was the estate solicitor. Frances had met him once. He had the honest, slightly pained expression of a man who dealt regularly with problems that fell outside the categories he had been trained for. She did not pick up the letter. She went to the window seat with the household accounts she had been working through and spent an hour with them. And then she went to find Nathaniel in the study because she had a question about a discrepancy in the autumn supply figures. And she found him at his desk, with the French letter open in front of him, and the expression of someone who is reading the same paragraph for the 4th time and arriving at the same insufficient understanding. She asked her question about the supply figures. He answered it, briefly and correctly. She started to leave. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe and said, without turning around, the subordinate clause in the 3rd paragraph, the one beginning with nonobstant les conditions précédentes, it supersedes the delivery guarantee in the 1st section. It means they can delay shipment by up to 60 days without penalty, regardless of what the rest of the contract appears to promise. A pause. She heard the sound of the letter being lifted from the desk. You read French, he said. My father was a wool merchant, she said. He had French suppliers from the time I was 12. I have been reading contracts since I was 14. Another pause. Longer. Come here, he said. Not as a command, but as a man who has just realized he has been solving the wrong problem and wants to see the right one clearly. She turned around and came back to the desk and spent the next hour going through the contract section by section, translating the French aloud and noting the places where the English summary his agent had provided diverged from what the document actually said. There were 4 such places. 2 of them were minor. 1 was significant. 1 was, she explained, the kind of clause that had been placed there deliberately to be overlooked, because it capped the liability of the French party in the event of a dispute in a way that left the Cresthollow estate with no legal recourse if the shipment arrived damaged. Nathaniel listened to all of it with the focused attention of a man who does not like to ask the same question twice. When she finished, he said, Can you write to them directly? In French, she said. Yes, do it, he said. She did. The response from the French company arrived 9 days later. Addressed to her by name, Madame la Duchess de Cresthollow, in a hand that suggested considerable relief, and it accepted the revised terms without negotiation, which Frances had been reasonably confident it would, because the tone of the original contract had been that of a party who expected not to be caught, and was therefore unprepared for the alternative. Nathaniel read the response in the morning room while Frances was there with her tea, and he read it twice, and then he set it down. He said, You renegotiated the liability clause. Yes, she said. You did not tell me you intended to do that. She looked at him over her teacup. You said to write to them directly. I meant to confirm the revised delivery terms. I confirmed those as well, she said. They are in the 2nd paragraph. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression she was learning to read as the preliminary to something that would otherwise be a reprimand and was being reconsidered in transit. He said, In future, tell me what you intend before you do it. She said, In future, give me the correspondence before it sits on the table for 2 days. He was quiet. She drank her tea. It was not. She would think later. An argument, exactly. It was more like a negotiation about what the terms of this arrangement were actually going to be, conducted in a language they were both still learning. Cecily arrived the following week with Dorothea and 3 trunks that suggested a visit of longer than the 3 days she had announced. She was shown to the guest rooms with every courtesy Cresthollow's staff was capable of, which was considerable, and she moved through the house with the assessing quality of a woman, cataloguing the value of things she is deciding whether to covet. She brought with her, unannounced, a reason she had business at Ashby Stead she wished to discuss with Francis, concerning the disposition of some of Francis's father's personal effects that remained in the late master's study and needed to be cleared before the room could be repurposed. Francis said she would come when she could arrange it. Cecily said she hoped it could be arranged soon, and looked at Francis with the expression she used when she was telling Francis something that was not being said aloud. And what was not being said aloud was that the room was going to be cleared with or without Francis's participation, and Francis should come quickly if she wanted any say in what was kept. Francis went on a Thursday, with Peg and a hired cart, and spent 4 hours in the room where her father had kept his business records and his correspondence, and, in the bottom left drawer of his desk, a collection of French almanacs from the years he had traded actively with Lyon. She sorted everything with the methodical attention she brought to ledgers, 1 pile for the solicitor, 1 pile for the estate records, 1 pile for herself, 1 pile for the fire. She found a letter from a London bank. She found 3 years of accounts she did not recognize, and then recognized as accounts that had not appeared in the estate records. Cecily had shown her father's creditors after his death, which was interesting, and which she set in the pile for the solicitor without comment. She found, at the very back of the top drawer, behind a box of nibs and a bottle of ink gone dry, a small envelope, plain white, her father's handwriting on the outside, very clear, for Agnes to keep safe. She held it for a long moment. It was empty. The flap had been opened, the contents removed, and the envelope replaced either by her father, taking back what he had put in, or by someone else, finding it after. She put it in her own pile. She brought it back to Cresthollow in her coat pocket and said nothing about it to anyone, because she did not yet understand what she had found. And she had learned early that speaking before understanding was its own kind of waste. The evening at Aldbourne went wrong in the specific way that evenings organized by people with agendas tend to go wrong too smoothly at first, and then all at once. It was a small supper at the home of a local magistrate. 8 people. Nothing that should have required anyone to manage anything. Cecily was at her most charming for the first 2 courses, which Francis found more alarming than her open hostility, because Cecily's charm was a thing she deployed with the economy of someone who knew exactly what it cost and expected a return. The return came at the end of the 3rd course, in a pause in the conversation, when Cecily said warmly, and to no one in particular, "I was just thinking how remarkable it is, the way Cresthollow has changed since your Grace's marriage." Francis always had such unusual ideas about how things should be done. Her father encouraged it. Bless him. Not everyone has the patience for it, I think. A small pause. We were all rather surprised, if I am honest, when we heard the news. A Duke of Cresthollow's standing. One does wonder what the match offers. Beyond the novelty. She said it with a smile. She said it with the tone of someone sharing an affectionate concern. 3 of the 8 people at the table looked at Francis. 2 looked at Nathaniel. 1 looked at their plate. Nathaniel was looking at Cecily with the expression Francis had seen him use exactly once before. In the drawing room at Ashby Stead, when he had turned from his mother to look at Cecily Ashby, standing in the center of the room with her gracious expression locked in place, he did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch to the point at which Cecily's smile began to require visible maintenance. Then he said, without changing his tone, "The match offers a great deal. As it happens, more. I think than is immediately visible. He picked up his wineglass. The conversation moved on, but Francis had heard the particular quality of those 2 sentences, not a defense, not quite a compliment, but a door being shut with quiet finality, and she sat with it the rest of the evening, and could not entirely account for what it did to the arithmetic she had been doing in her head since September. The library at Cresthollow was empty on a Friday morning in November when Agnes Crale came in without knocking, which was her habit in her son's house, and which Francis had come to understand was not rudeness, but a particular kind of trust. Agnes only entered rooms without knocking when she intended to stay. She was carrying nothing except her coat, which she had not yet removed, and she sat down in the chair across from Francis's writing desk with the deliberateness of someone who has decided something and arrived at the moment of acting on it. Francis set her pen down. She waited. Agnes looked at her for a long moment with the sharp grey eyes that had assessed her at the garden gate and had apparently continued assessing her in the 8 weeks since. Then Agnes reached into the inner pocket of her coat and placed a sealed envelope on the desk between them. It was not a new envelope. The paper had the quality of age, not deteriorated, but settled. The way paper settles when it has been kept carefully in one place for a long time. The seal was intact. The handwriting on the outside was not Agnes's. Francis looked at it and felt the particular cold clarity she associated with things that were about to reorganize everything she thought she understood. And she recognized the hand on the front of the envelope because she had seen it 4 days ago on the back of an empty envelope in the bottom drawer of her father's desk. The ink was darker on this one. The letters were the same. For Agnes to keep safe. "Your father gave me this 4 years ago," Agnes said, 3 weeks before he died. "He came to Cresthollow specifically. Without telling your aunt he was coming, and he asked me to keep it until you were in a position to use it safely." She paused. "I have been waiting for you to be in a position to use it safely." Francis looked at the envelope. "You knew who I was," she said. "At the gate. I knew your name," Agnes said. "I had not met you before. But yes, I knew who you were," Francis said. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" Agnes looked at her steadily. "Because sooner you were living in Cecily Ashby's house," she said, "and anything I gave you there she would have taken." Francis broke the seal. The document inside was 4 pages. Written in her father's hand, witnessed by a signature she did not immediately recognize, and a second signature below it that she did recognize because she had seen it on 3 years of Agnes Crale's correspondence that passed through the Cresthollow morning room. Agnes Margaret Crale, written in the same plain, confident hand that wrote everything else. She read it once quickly and then again slowly. The way she read contracts, she did not want to misunderstand. It was a will, dated 6 weeks before her father's death, which made it later than the will Cecily had produced for the solicitors. The will that had given Cecily control of Ashby stead and left Francis a sum of money that had proved, on examination, to be considerably smaller than her father's estate should have produced. This document left Ashby stead in its entirety the house, the land, the tenant leases, the entirety of the associated holdings to Frances Margaret Ashby, daughter of James Ashby. On the occasion of her majority or her marriage, whichever came first, it left Cecily Ashby a pension, adequate and not generous. It left Dorothea nothing, which Francis suspected Dorothea had always known and had spent 3 years not forgiving. She set it down on the desk. The fire crackled. Outside the library window, the November garden was bare and grey and very still. "He told you what was in it," Francis said. "He told me enough," Agnes said. He was frightened Cecily would contest it if he filed it in the ordinary way. He had reason to be. She had already Agnes stopped. There were things that happened in the last year of his illness that he did not tell you about. He did not want you to carry them. Frances looked at her. He should have told me. She said, yes. Agnes agreed, with the simplicity of someone who agrees completely and knows that agreeing changes nothing. He should have. He thought he was protecting you. Frances was quiet for a moment. He was protecting me from information I needed. She said, yes. Agnes said again. She was still sitting at the desk with the will in her hands when she heard Nathaniel's step in the corridor. She had learned his step, the particular rhythm of it, the way it paused at the library door when he was deciding whether to come in. He came in. He looked at Agnes first, which was reflex, and then at Frances, and then at the document on the desk. And she watched the sequence of things that moved across his face in the space of 3 seconds. Recognition of the envelope, which he must have seen Agnes carry in, and then the stillness that followed recognition, and then the thing underneath the stillness that she could not yet name. He crossed the room and picked up the will without asking, which she found she did not mind, because he read it the way she read things, quickly first, then carefully, then back to the beginning to check what he had understood against what was actually there. He set it down. He looked at Agnes. How long have you had this? 4 years, Agnes said. He was quiet for a moment. She knew what he was thinking, because she had learned enough about how he thought to follow the sequence his mother had been keeping a secret that concerned his household, his marriage, and the legal standing of his wife. And she had not told him. You might have mentioned it, he said, in the tone that was not quite anger and not quite not. I might have, Agnes agreed, without apology. I also might have given it to Frances in October and had Cecily contest it through 3 solicitors before it reached a notary, which is exactly what would have happened if I had moved before Frances was in a position to act on it. You would have done the same thing, and you know it. He looked at her for another moment. He did not argue the point, which Frances noted. He turned to Frances and said, this supersedes the will Cecily submitted. Yes, Frances said. Cecily's document was filed after this one was written. The date can be verified. The parish register, Agnes said. Your father and I went to the church in Aldbourne to have it witnessed. The vicar signed it. It will be in the register. Frances looked at the second witness signature on the 4th page, the one she had not recognized, and looked at the date, and understood. You were both there, she said to Agnes. We were both there, Agnes said. Nathaniel picked up the will again and read it a 3rd time, standing, with the focused expression of a man converting what he has understood into what he is going to do about it. Frances watched him and waited, because she had learned that his thinking was not something that benefited from interruption. When he looked up, he said, I will take this to Caldwell today, Frances said. There is also a set of accounts I found in my father's study. They do not match the figures Cecily presented to the creditors after his death. They are with the solicitor in Aldbourne already. He looked at her with the expression she now recognized as the one that preceded a significant recalibration. When did you send them? He said. 3 weeks ago, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You have been building a case, he said. It was not quite an accusation. I have been keeping records, she said, in case they were needed. I did not know about the will, but I knew the figures were wrong. And I knew Cecily had reasons to want me not to know. He set the will down. He looked at her with the directness he rarely used, not the closed cabinet expression, but something behind it, something he had not yet decided to name. You should have told me, he said. She held his gaze. You told me not to involve myself in your correspondence or your estate affairs, she said. I was working within the terms you set. He absorbed this. She let him absorb it. The terms, he said, are under revision. I know, she said. She did not hear the carriage until Peg appeared in the library doorway with the expression she wore for bad news that had arrived ahead of schedule. Cecily and Dorothea, Peg said, in the entrance hall, with a man Frances did not know who had a document case and the look of a solicitor engaged to do something unpleasant. Nathaniel looked at Frances. She looked at the will on the desk. He picked it up, folded it, and placed it inside his coat. "Stay here," he said, and left the library. And Frances stayed for exactly 45 seconds before she followed. Because staying was not something she was any longer willing to do on instruction, when the thing being decided in the next room was the whole of her life. Cecily had positioned herself in the entrance hall with the instinct of a woman who understood spatial advantage near the door. Her solicitor beside her, with the document case open on the hall table. Dorothea slightly behind, and to the left in the arrangement that suggested support without requiring speech. She looked at Nathaniel when he appeared, and she looked at the set of his shoulders and the flatness of his expression, and something shifted in her posture, not retreat, but recalculation. "Your Grace," she said, with a smile, "I apologize for the informality. I have become aware of a document that appears to be circulating a forgery. I am afraid, representing itself as my brother's final will. My solicitor has the certified copy of the genuine document, filed with the probate court in Derby. I thought it best to address the matter directly rather than allow any confusion to develop." Her solicitor placed a document on the hall table with the practiced motion of a man who has done this before. "The authentic will," Cecily said, "clearly names me as primary beneficiary and executor. Any subsequent document is, my solicitor advises me, very likely the work of someone attempting to defraud the estate." She did not look at Frances. She looked at Nathaniel. It was, Frances thought, the correct tactical choice. Cecily had always understood that the conversation that mattered happened between people with power, and she had always excluded Frances from that category by default. Nathaniel looked at the document on the table. He did not touch it. He said, "Your brother visited Aldbourne in the autumn of 1809. It was not a question." Cecily's smile held. "He did. Yes, he was unwell that autumn. As you may recall, he was not always clear in his intention. It is a difficult thing to say of one's own family. But he visited the parish church," Nathaniel said, "with Agnes Crale, and had a document witnessed by the vicar and entered in the parish register." The smile required more maintenance now. "I am not aware of any such visit," Cecily said. "No," Nathaniel said. "I imagine you are not." He reached into his coat and produced the will, unfolded it, and laid it on the hall table beside Cecily's document without comment. Cecily looked at it. Her solicitor looked at it. Dorothea looked at the floor. The hall was very quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that happens when several people in a room are all calculating simultaneously, and none of them have arrived at the same number. "That document," Cecily said carefully, "has no verified provenance. The witness signatures cannot be confirmed without. The parish register can be consulted this afternoon," Nathaniel said. "I intend to send Caldwell there directly. If you wish to accompany him, you are welcome to do so." Another pause. "Furthermore," he said, in the same even tone, "I am aware of a discrepancy between the estate accounts your brother maintained before his death and the accounts presented to his creditors at probate. Those accounts are currently being reviewed by a solicitor in Aldbourne. I would advise your own solicitor to be available for that conversation." Cecily's face did something complicated. She looked, for the first time in Francis's memory, like a woman who has run the numbers and found them wrong. Dorothea made a small sound that was not quite a word and pressed her hand to her mouth. Cecily looked at Francis, then really looked at her. Not the managing look, not the performance look, but the look underneath both of those. The one that was simply a woman who was frightened and was trying not to show it. She said, quietly, stepping fractionally closer, so that the words did not carry to Nathaniel. He would never have respected you if I had not forced him to look at you. You know that, don't you? Francis held her gaze. The words landed, because they were designed to land, and because Cecily, whatever else she was, had always been precise about where to aim. She said, after a moment, perhaps, but that is not your decision to make for me. Cecily looked at her for another second. Then she stepped back. She said, to her solicitor, we will need to revisit our position. And to Nathaniel, Your Grace, in the tone of a formal withdrawal. And to no one, nothing further. She picked up her gloves from the hall table. She left. Dorothea followed. The door closed. Francis stood in the entrance hall with Nathaniel and Peg, and the sound of the carriage leaving on the gravel drive. And she thought about what Cecily had said. And she thought about what she had said back. And she thought about whether it was true, the first part. The part about being forced into visibility, and she found she could not answer it cleanly. Which meant it was at least partially true. Which was the kind of true that was most difficult to carry. The solicitor's office in Aldbourne occupied the upper floor of a building on the north side of the market square, accessed by a staircase that had been built for people shorter than most of its current visitors and lit by a window that faced northeast and provided, even on clear days, a quality of light that strongly suggested the transaction being conducted was unlikely to go well for someone. Francis arrived at 8:30 on a Saturday morning in November, before the square had fully woken. With the will in the locked document case she had borrowed from Nathaniel's study, without asking, because asking would have required an explanation she had not yet worked out how to give. She had not slept particularly well. She had spent the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning going through the argument in her head, not the argument with Cecily, which was finished, but the argument she could not stop having with herself about what she was doing and whether she was right to do it alone. She was not alone, as it turned out, in the sense that mattered. The solicitor, a man named Hartwell, who had handled Cecily's affairs for 6 years and had, in that time, developed loyalties that Francis had perhaps underestimated, listened to her present, the will with the expression of a man who had been told something was coming and had prepared for it. He examined the document with the careful attention of a professional and the underlying disengagement of a man who has already reached a conclusion. He said, when she finished, that the matter was more complex than she might appreciate, that a document of this nature, produced so long after the original probate, would require extensive verification, that the witness signatures could not be taken at face value without corroboration, that the interests of the current holder of the estate would need to be formally represented before any legal action could proceed. That he was afraid he could not in good conscience recommend, "You have already spoken to Cecily Ashby," Francis said. Hartwell looked at his desk. "I have professional obligations," he said. "That predate your graces, yes," Francis said. She stood up. She picked up the document case. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," and went down the stairs and out into the market square, which was beginning to show signs of life now. Carts arriving and shutters being opened, and a boy from the bakery carrying a tray of bread across the cobbles in the thin morning light. She stood at the edge of the square with the document case under her arm and the cold coming through her coat and thought, with a clarity that was not comfortable but was at least honest. She had known, somewhere, that this might happen. She had come anyway. She was not certain whether that had been brave or simply impatient, and she was not certain the distinction mattered now. She walked back to the inn where Peg was waiting with the carriage and told Peg what had happened. And Peg listened with the full attention she gave to things she had been half expecting, and said, "What do we do now?" Francis said, "I need to speak to Nathaniel." Peg looked at her with the expression she used when Francis said something obvious that had taken longer to arrive than Peg thought it should have. "Yes," Peg said. "I imagine you do." He was in the study when she returned, which she had known he would be Saturday mornings were for correspondence, and he did not vary his schedule for anything short of an emergency, which was one of the things she had come to find reliable about him, even when she found other things about him less so. She opened the door without knocking, which was something she had not done before, and he looked up with the expression that preceded an observation about being interrupted, and she said, before he could speak, "Hartwell refused to see the will. He has been retained by Cecily already. I went this morning without telling you, and it did not work. And I am telling you now, because I should have told you before I went, and I did not. And I am sorry for that." He was quiet for a moment. He set his pen down. He said, "Sit down." She sat. "Tell me what happened," he said, and she told him all of it, including the part where she had taken his document case without asking, which she saw him register and set aside for later. When she finished, he was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet from the closed cabinet silence. It was the quiet of a man who was deciding, rapidly, and did not want to be interrupted while he decided. He stood up. He went to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the kitchen garden, and then he turned around and said, "I need to go to Derby." She did not ask why immediately. She looked at him and waited, which she had learned was the more efficient approach. The 4-year suit against Viscount Wenlock. He said, "I have been building it since my brother died. Land dispute. Wenlock took a lease he had no right to take, and the case has been in preparation since 1810. My counsel is ready. I have been ready. I intended to file in January." He stopped. He looked at her with the direct expression, the one behind the cabinet. "If I use Caldwell and my London counsel on the Duke the will, I cannot run both simultaneously. The resources do not stretch to both. The Wenlock case is mine. The will is yours." He said it simply, without drama, which made it more difficult to hear than drama would have. "If you go to Derby," she said carefully, "you are dropping the case. I am withdrawing it." He said, "There is a difference. Nathaniel, my brother has been dead 4 years." He said, "The land is not coming back regardless of the verdict, because Wenlock sold it 2 years ago, and the current holder is innocent of the original dispute. I have been conducting a legal action for the satisfaction of a principle, and principles are not worth more than he stopped, than a person's home." She looked at him across the study. He looked back. Outside the window, the kitchen garden sat bare and brown in the November light. The same garden she had looked at through the library window on her first week at Cresthollow, when she had been learning what kind of house this was. "You built that case for 4 years," she said. "I know what I built it for," he said. He left for Derby the following morning before she was up, which she had not expected, and she found on the breakfast table a note in his hand that said only, "Caldwell will call at 10. Give him the will and the Aldbourne accounts. Tell him everything." She held the note for a long moment, and then she did what it said. Caldwell arrived at 10:05, and listened to everything with the focused attention of a man who has just been given a problem he can solve and is relieved to have it. He took the will. He took the account discrepancy documents. He asked several precise questions about the parish register and the date of the original probate filing, and Francis answered all of them. And by the end of the hour, he had the shape of the argument assembled and was already thinking. She could tell about which elements to lead with. He said, before he left, His Grace instructed me that this matter takes precedence over everything else currently in preparation. He said it in the neutral tone of a professional reporting a fact, but he looked at her while he said it in a way that was not entirely neutral, and she thought she understood what he was not saying, which was that the instruction had been given clearly and without hesitation, and that Caldwell, who had worked for Nathaniel Crale for 9 years, had found it notable. Nathaniel returned from Derby on a Wednesday. He came into the morning room where Francis was sitting with Agnes, who had arrived that morning without announcement in her usual way, and he sat down and told them what had been done. The Wenlock case was withdrawn. His London counsel had been redirected to the will matter and had already been in contact with Caldwell. The parish register had been consulted, and the entry confirmed the vicar of Aldbourne, now retired but traceable, had been located in Bath and had provided a written statement confirming the witnessed signing. The discrepancy in the Ashby estate accounts was being reviewed by a court-appointed examiner. Cecily's solicitor Hartwell had been informed that his client's position was significantly weaker than she had been advised, which Caldwell had delivered in the particular careful language of a man who means something stronger than what he is saying. Agnes listened to all of this and looked at her tea and said nothing, which meant she had known most of it already and was satisfied. Francis looked at Nathaniel and said, "You withdrew the Wenlock case. We have discussed this." He said, "We discussed it once." She said, "That was enough." He said, "For you, perhaps." He looked at her. "The case was not going to give me back what I lost." He said, "The will might give you back what you lost. These are not equivalent situations." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Cecily had said in the entrance hall about visibility, about respect, about what was and was not given freely. She thought about whether Cecily had been right. She thought it did not matter whether Cecily had been right, because whatever had brought Nathaniel Crale to this point, it was not the garden gate, and it was not the tea, and it was not anything that could be reduced to a transaction. "Thank you," she said. He said, "You are welcome," in the tone of someone accepting thanks for something that was not. In his own accounting, a favor. The hearing at the Aldbourne public rooms was not dramatic in the way of things that should be dramatic. It was a grey Thursday morning in December, and the room smelled of cold stone and old paper and the tallow of the lamps that had been lit against the early dark. And there were perhaps 20 people present, including the court examiner and both solicitors, and Agnes Crale, sitting in the third row with her hands folded, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting 4 years for a Thursday in December and finds it exactly as she expected. Cecily and Dorothea were in the second row. Cecily's solicitor presented the probate will. Caldwell presented the Aldbourne will. The parish register entry was read into the record. The retired vicar's written statement was presented. The court examiner examined the dates and the witness signatures and the chain of custody and asked Cecily's solicitor 4 questions, each of which the solicitor answered with decreasing confidence. The account discrepancy was noted as a separate matter for further examination, which meant it was not finished, but it was begun, and beginning was sufficient for now. Cecily sat through all of it with the controlled stillness of a woman who has decided that the only dignified response to losing is to lose without visible movement. When the examiner concluded that the Aldbourne will appeared to be the valid final testament and that the matter would be referred to the probate court for formal confirmation, Cecily stood up and picked up her gloves from her lap with the same careful movements she used for everything, and looked at Francis across the room for a moment, not the entrance hall look, not the managing look, but something underneath all of them, something that was simply tired. She did not say anything. She put on her gloves and left, and Dorothea followed, and Agnes watched them go with the expression of a woman who has done what she came to do and considers the account settled. Francis stood in the emptying room and felt the thing she had expected to feel: relief, something close to it, the specific sensation of a threat ceasing, and underneath it something she had not expected, which was the exhaustion of having held herself carefully for so long that releasing the tension was almost painful. Nathaniel was beside her, close enough that their arms touched, and she was aware of that contact in the way she had become aware of everything about his proximity carefully, and without knowing entirely what to do with the information. Agnes came and put her hand on Francis' arm for a moment, the same gesture she had used in the solicitor's office, and said nothing, and left. In the carriage going back to Cresthollow, Nathaniel did not read. He sat across from her in the early dark of a December afternoon, and was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was not avoiding something but simply present with it. And Francis looked out the window at the Derbyshire fields, going dark under a sky that had been threatening snow all day and had not yet delivered on the threat. She said, without particularly planning to, "Cecily said something to me in the entrance hall. The day she came with the solicitor, he waited. She said you would never have looked at me if she had not forced the situation, that I owed my position here to her. In a manner of speaking." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to her?" I said. "It was not her decision to make for me." Francis said, "That was the correct answer." He said. She looked at him. "But was she wrong?" she said. He looked back at her with the directness she had learned to read as the expression he used when he was going to say something he had decided not to soften. "She was wrong about the conclusion," he said. "She was not entirely wrong about the beginning. I would not have known to look." He paused. "I am looking now," he said, without any assistance from Cecily Ashby. She held his gaze across the dark carriage. She said, "That is a very precise distinction. I am a precise man." He said. She said, "I know." And then, because she was also precise when it mattered, "I am glad you are looking." He was quiet for another moment. Outside, the first snow had begun, very lightly, against the carriage window. "So am I," he said. He came to her sitting room that evening with a tray, which he was carrying himself, which she understood from the expression of the housemaid she passed on the stairs had caused some consternation in the kitchen. On the tray was a teapot and 2 cups, and a small plate of the almond biscuits that Marsh had apparently told him Francis took with tea in the evenings, which meant he had asked Marsh, which meant he had done it deliberately and in advance. He set the tray on the table by the fire. He poured a cup and held it out to her. His technique was not quite right, too much tea, not enough time steeped, but she took it with both hands, the way she had taken everything in this house, and drank it, and found it was not wrong enough to matter. "You asked Marsh how I take my tea," she said. "I asked Peg," he corrected. Marsh was more forthcoming, but Peg was more accurate. She looked at the cup. "It is slightly too strong," she said. "I know," he said. "I will improve." She looked at him. He looked back. He said, without preamble and without the careful organizational tone he used for things he had rehearsed, "I withdrew the Wenlock case because it was the right thing to do with what I had, and what I had was mine to use as I chose. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to be thanked for it. I am telling you because you asked whether Cecily was right, and the answer requires more than one sentence. And the complete answer includes this. I have been watching you read things other people cannot read, and fix things other people walk past, and hold yourself to a standard no one asked you to hold yourself to, in a house that gave you nothing to work with, for 3 months. None of that was because of Cecily Ashby. He stopped. Frances looked at the fire. She thought about what he had said and what he had not said, and the distance between them, and whether it was the same distance it had been in September, and found it was not. You are not good at this, she said. He said. No, she said. Neither am I, he said. I know. She looked at him then, fully, the way she had been careful not to look at him in the early weeks, and found that being careful was no longer something she needed to practice. We could be bad at it together, she said, and improve over time. Something shifted in his face, not a smile exactly, but the preliminary to one. The thing that happened before a man who had spent years keeping his expression closed allowed it to open. That, he said, is the most practical proposal I have heard in some time. She drank her too strong tea. He sat down across from her. The fire crackled. Outside the sitting room window, the snow that had been threatening all day was falling properly now, soft and steady and without drama, the way the best things happened. The morning after, Frances rose early and went to Ashby Stead. Not to claim it, the formal process would take months, and she had accepted that, but simply to stand at the gate where Agnes had fallen in September and look at the house her father had built, with Peg beside her and the snow from the night before, lying thin and clean on the gravel path. Nathaniel came an hour later, on horseback, with mud on his boots and the look of a man who had ridden across in the early morning because he had decided to, which was the only reason he ever did anything. He dismounted and stood beside her at the gate and looked at the house. He did not say, "This is yours now," because it was not quite yet, and he was too precise for things that were not quite yet. He said nothing at all, which was better. Frances looked at the gate latch, still loose after all these months, and thought about the afternoon in September when a woman had fallen here and a room full of people had laughed, and thought about what that afternoon had become, and found she could not trace the line between that moment and this one without passing through so many choices. Hers and his and Agnes's and her father's made 4 years ago in a church in Aldbourne, that the line was less a line than a ledger entries made and carried forward, none of them wasted. It was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales did not require parish registers and 4 years of patience and a solicitor named Caldwell. But there were things that did not need to be fairy tales to be worth everything, and she was standing at the gate of one of them. This is a story about what it costs to keep something safe for someone who does not yet know they need it, kept, and what it costs, in the end, to stop running the numbers and simply say what you mean. If you stayed until the last page of the ledger, you already know that your taste in stories is impeccable, and this channel is very glad you are here. If this one stayed with you, please like the video and share it with someone who believes that the quietest loyalty is sometimes the most expensive kind. Subscribe and hit the bell. We release a new story every week, and next week's begins somewhere you will not expect. Before you go, we have a question that we genuinely cannot agree on. Nathaniel withdrew the Wenlock case without asking Frances first. He made the decision alone, acted on it, and told her afterward. Given everything, he sacrificed 4 years, his brother's unfinished business, the principle he had built his grief around. Did he have the right to make that choice without her? Or was it one more instance of a man deciding what a woman needs before she has been asked? We want to know where you land. Leave it in the comments. We read every one. We will see you next week.